On October 14, 2008, Canada went to the polls for a federal election. The Conservative Party under Prime Minister Stephen Harper went from a minority government to a slightly larger minority government. For those unfamiliar with how a parliamentary system works, if your party has the most seats, you have the government. But if you do not also have over 50% of the seats, you then have a minority government. Sure, you're the largest, but you're outnumbered by all of your opponents. This leads to issues in that a government wanting to pass an agenda or legislation won't be able to without the support of their political rivals. Depending on your personal philosophy of government, this can either be a good thing because it forces people to work together and compromise, or a bad thing because nothing you want gets done. In this case, the Conservative Party got more seats, but logistically the situation didn't change. With the 2008 financial crisis causing trouble in Canada, there was a sharp divisiveness on how to handle it, and an electoral stalemate didn't help. The pressure to act on the financial crisis made Harper's opponents willing to try something different to defeat him: a coalition. If enough opponents agree to work together and they collectively have more seats than the minority government, they'd become the new government. With most parliaments, coalitions are normal. Otherwise, how would Slovakia and its 7+ political factions get anything done? But in Canada, coalitions are kind of taboo. While Canada usually had several political parties in parliament, usually two parties greatly outperformed the rest: the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. Although at one time it used to be called the Progressive Conservative Party, but we'll get into that later. So basically, Canada is usually a two-ish party system, where every once in a while a third party might hold the balance of power, but that would usually be handled with random negotiations, not an official coalition. The bigger parties didn't feel like sharing the reins of power with a small party just over a couple of seats, while the smaller parties were worried about losing their political independence if they were strong-armed by the bigger parties over just a few policy tweaks. The only coalition at the federal level in Canadian history was when the Liberal Party split over conscription for World War I in 1917. The pro-conscription faction of Liberals made a coalition with the Conservative government of Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden for the remainder of World War I. So now, 91 years later, there was finally going to be an attempt at a second possible coalition. The Liberal Party, New Democratic Party, and Bloc Québécois Party came to an agreement in which there would be a Liberal NDP coalition government with a 75-25 split of ministers. The Bloc would then support them in Parliament for 18 months, giving at minimum an 18-month guarantee of a new Liberal NDP minority government with majority support. All three parties would then vote for a motion of no confidence in Stephen Harper's government, and the new coalition government could determine the budget. Yeah, it's a bit complicated, but all technically valid within a parliamentary system. But Stephen Harper had a plan. Coalitions were already considered taboo in Canadian politics to begin with, but the fact that this attempt to oust Prime Minister Harper was happening not only before a budget was passed, but barely a month after the election was perfect for Harper's rebuttal. Harper went public, claiming that this was an undemocratic backroom dealing. Two parties the Canadian people rejected were going to take power from the party the Canadians mainly voted for in some weird parliamentary coup? Outrageous.
Mr. Speaker, this deal that the leader of the Liberal Party has made with the separatists is a betrayal of the voters of this country, a betrayal of the best interests of our economy, a betrayal of the best interests of our country, and we will fight it with every means.
It may have been legal, but to the average person, it looked shady. Sure, inside the government, one could argue that they were simply doing whatever it took to properly address the financial crisis, even if they had to play dirty. But on the outside, you don't necessarily know all of that. As a result, Harper's attacks resonated with many people. Harper also got lucky in that the Liberal Party's official response from their leader Stéphane Dion defending the coalition went horribly wrong. The response arrived late to the news stations, causing an awkward delay. Then when it did air, the quality of the tape was terrible and the whole thing looked rushed. All of this just embarrassed the Liberal Party and made it look like that they were stuttering and unable to justify their actions. This was so bad that many Liberals were calling for new leadership. Ultimately though, the decision came down to the Governor-General of Canada. Basically, the Queen of England, the Queen of Canada's representative to make sure that things stayed constitutional. The Governor-General at the time, MacLeod, ultimately decided that while coalitions and no confidence votes are perfectly valid, the timing was too early and that the government hadn't had the proper chance to try and negotiate a budget in the first place as normally intended. So she decided to prorogue Parliament, meaning end the session of Parliament, but not for an election. There'd be a break over the winter holidays, and when Parliament reconvened, they could try negotiating the budget again. While in theory this could have just delayed the inevitable and they could have tried a coalition later, this ultimately worked in Harper's favor. Dion over the break lost the leadership role of the Liberal Party and would be replaced by Michael Ignatieff. Because of how much this whole thing embarrassed the Liberals, Ignatieff decided to abandon this coalition idea and the whole thing fell apart. Ignatieff even agreed to support the Conservative Party's budget, not wanting to prolong the uncertainty. Harper's government was safe for now. However, this move was also not the best. Eventually, a motion of no confidence was tried again on October 1st, 2009, but it didn't work. The Conservatives had agreed to pass an NDP measure to give $1 billion in enhanced benefits for unemployed workers, and the NDP didn't want to screw that up, especially when the financial crisis meant that this financial safety net would be more critical than ever. So, the NDP abstained, and the motion failed. This hurt Ignatieff's standing, and so if they ever wanted to try again, they would have to wait. Eventually, on March 23, 2011, the Liberals try a third time, and both the NDP and the Bloc Québécois support it. On the 25th, the motion passed, and Parliament is finally dissolved, ready for another election. The next few weeks would result in one of Canada's strangest elections, one in which both the expected and unexpected would happen. The basic outcome would be one that most of you watching could probably predict, but the full outcome and how it would get there is quite a fascinating moment in Canadian political history. An election always has many players, especially considering that a parliamentary election is electing hundreds of candidates to individual seats, but obviously it's important to at least go through the party leaders. Well, the major party leaders. Well, okay, the party leaders that are major to this election. There we go. Let's start with Prime Minister Stephen Harper. From the 1940s through the 1980s, the main opponent of the Canadian Liberal Party was the Progressive Conservative Party. Basically, it was a big tent party for the center-right aligned on loose conservative values. However, like most center-right parties in the West, during the 1980s there was a shift towards liberal free market economics that became a dividing issue between the more moderates and the more conservatives of the party. Progressive Conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney tried to govern with a broad coalition of conservatives, moderates, disgruntled Quebecois, and disgruntled Western Canadians, but he couldn't keep this coalition together for very long. In 1987, a conservative populist party known as the Reform Party of Canada was formed by a man named Preston Manning. Manning basically wanted a more solidly conservative party, and Reform soon found themselves very popular in Western Canada. Stephen Harper got his political start back in 1987 by becoming their chief policy officer. In 1993, the Progressive Conservative Party, despite getting third place in the popular vote, only got 2 seats in the entire House of Commons. Reform, due to being so concentrated in the West, not only got second place in the vote count, but also 52 seats, one of which was won by Stephen Harper. However, Stephen Harper would grow to disagree with Preston Manning's more populist style of political philosophy, believing that wholly sticking to conservative principles were more important. In 1997, he decided not to run for re-election. When out of Parliament, Stephen Harper tried to argue that a coalition of voters committed to conservative principles and conservative economics should be the way to go, as sticking to regional voting blocks would hinder further success, which, on that last part, he was certainly right on the money there. The Reform Party did try to break out of the West by rebranding itself to the Canadian Alliance Party in the year 2000, hoping to win over the remaining progressive conservative voters further out east. Preston Manning was replaced by Stockwell Day. However, Day was less populist like Manning and leaned in a more Christian right-wing direction, and Harper was worried that this would alienate too many people and decided to jump back into politics to challenge his leadership. Stephen Harper succeeded and became the new leader of the Canadian Alliance Party in 2002. To add some additional symbolism, Harper's new seat in Parliament was Preston Manning's old seat as he decided to retire earlier that year. The next step for Harper was to negotiate a unification of the Canadian Alliance Party and the Progressive Conservative Party. After some negotiations and a vote of approval from both parties, they united in late 2003 and formed the new Conservative Party of Canada. Harper had no issue winning the leadership election, and in 2004 led the new party to official opposition. In 2006, he finally became Canada's Prime Minister by winning a minority government, and of course I already covered what happened in 2008. Throughout his first 2 ministries, he did many things you'd expect a typical Conservative government to do at this time. More fiscal budgeting, continual support for the war on terrorism, and either skepticism or hostility towards many environmental initiatives at the time, such as the Kyoto Accord. Harper, in both his appeals to conservatives and his criticisms, was quickly compared to US President George W. Bush. He was also memed for some of his awkward moments like any politician, one in particular being that he had perfect Lego hair. However, the overarching story of Stephen Harper's political career up to this point can be summed up as someone trying to prove that they don't need a big tent coalition to succeed. While he was winning seats outside of Western Canada, he was still trying to prove he could win a majority government. Michael Ignatieff took over the Liberal Party at a weird time in its history. From 1968 through 2003, the Liberal Party had been either led by Pierre Trudeau or someone who worked in his administration. Paul Martin led the party from 2003 until his loss in 2006, which led to Dionne's short leadership from 2006 to 2008. After half a century of either strong or familiar leadership from the same cloth, the Liberal Party wasn't really finding anyone new who could stick. The party began to believe that perhaps they needed to think outside the box instead of relying on what little is left from before. Michael Ignatieff himself was so outside the box that despite having been born and raised in Canada, he actually spent most of his adult life outside of Canada. He went to Oxford and Harvard for studies and then had a career giving lectures at multiple universities across America and Europe. He also had a career being an award-winning presenter for the BBC in the UK and wrote award-winning books. Once he moved back to Canada in the year 2000, his popularity amongst Canadians grew, but among a more centrist crowd. He simultaneously criticized American imperialism and human rights abuses in the war on terror, while also saying that sometimes extra measures were necessary for terrorists, and also supporting the 2003 invasion of Iraq. With the high amount of jingoism present in the post-9/11 world, some people thought his stance of supporting the war on terror but also wanting to protect human rights for innocent civilians would be the viable alternative for the Liberal Party to embrace.
We can do the job of being tough in interrogation without resorting to abuse and without resorting to torture. That's the kind of balance I'm trying to strike.
Others kind of saw him as wishy-washy at best and a hypocrite at worst. In fact, in 2007, he took back his support for the war in Iraq altogether, but some claimed his humanitarian reputation was already stained. In 2006, he was convinced to enter politics and won his seat in Parliament, and then he won his leadership battle for the party in late 2008 after the coalition fiasco. So the Liberals were hoping that an intellectual centrist would be seen as moderate enough to win over some moderate conservatives, but still at least promote liberal ideas. If Stephen Harper was slowly building up his support until it worked, Ignatieff was the Liberals just throwing things against the wall to see what will stick. So Quebec is also famous for not only being the major hub of Canadian French, but also being very prideful in its own culture to the point of having tried to secede from Canada twice in the 20th century. The second secession attempt was the product of the Bloc Québécois party, a center-left party dedicated to Québécois sovereignty and independence that formed in 1991. During the 80s, Prime Minister Mulroney had tried to court the Québécois for his coalition, but a man named Lucien Bouchard felt betrayed by Mulroney's administration after serving as his Secretary of State and Minister of the Environment, feeling that his concessions towards Quebec weren't good enough. Gilles Duceppe was elected to Parliament in 1990 as an independent, and then later joined the Bloc upon its formation. In 1996, Bouchard stepped down and Duceppe became the party's interim leader, and eventually became their leader outright in 1997. For a few months before 1997's elections, he was actually serving time as the leader of the opposition in the federal government, which, I suppose being a secessionist is about as opposing you can be towards the sitting government, but that is kind of ironic. Despite the 1995 Quebec independence referendum failing, the Bloc Québécois still stuck around trying to get as many concessions for Quebec or French-speaking Canadians as it could, even after losing its opposition status to the new Conservative Party. Quebec's large size guaranteed a potential sizable number of seats for them in any given election, and Duceppe was still leading the party as of 2011, promoting pro-Québécois concessions and voting against most of Stephen Harper's measures. Jack Layton was the son of conservative politician Robert Layton, who briefly served as Brian Mulroney's Minister of State. However, Layton would politically move in the opposite direction and join the New Democratic Party in the 1970s. The New Democratic Party is a left-wing party in Canada that never had government but often had a small chunk of seats in Parliament. During closer elections, they could hold the balance of power between the Liberals and Conservatives. The NDP's original leader, Tommy Douglas, is given credit as the man behind the Canadian universal healthcare system. If you had to make an American comparison, if the Liberal Party is kind of like the moderate Democratic Party in the US, then the NDP is kind of like a Bernie Sanders party in a way. Jack Layton uniquely got his political start in municipal politics, being first elected to the Toronto City Council in 1982. He quickly became beloved by the city for his tireless social activism for the downtrodden of the city. He also became an advocate for AIDS patients in a time when many people weren't sympathetic towards them, even giving a televised address that added to his image of general kindness.
We also have the capacity to care for our fellows. Let's do these things instead of allowing the superstitious and vindictive side of the human personality to dominate our response to the AIDS crisis.
I mean, here he is in the 90s as a Trekkie at a comic convention, and that kind of says it all, doesn't it? In 1991, he tried to run for mayor of Toronto, but did not succeed. In 1997, he tried to run for parliament in Toronto Danforth, but also failed. With these losses, Jack Layton turned his attention to renewable energy, playing a part in developing a cooperative named WindShare, which built the first wind turbine in a major North American city center to bring renewable energy to parts of Toronto in 2002. But federal politics would call him again, and he decided to run for the leadership of the NDP. This time he won and was elected the NDP leader in 2003 on the first ballot. Jack Layton's personal popularity led the NDP to doubling their vote count in the 2004 federal election, but it only translated to going from 14 seats to 19 seats. Jack Layton being introduced to a nationwide audience only increased his popularity as he focused on optimism, helping those in need and giving that kind old man energy that even if you disagreed with him, it's really hard not to like him. In 2006, the NDP grew in votes and seats again, ending up with 29 seats. In 2008, 37 seats. While the NDP was getting third place consistently in the vote count, there were things preventing it from being competitive with the other parties. While they are a third option for Canadians, they aren't in between the Liberals and Conservatives, but to the left of both. But Jack Layton's personal appeal was showing some results, and by 2011 he was one of the most respected members in Parliament. When the Liberals were moving more to the center, the NDP under Jack wasn't budging. The final candidate of note, Elizabeth May, is by far the smallest of the five in terms of political power and popularity at the start of the election. May was born in Connecticut in 1954, but moved to Canada with her family in 1972, and she became a citizen in 1978. Politically in the 80s, she got her start through environmental activism. She even tried to make her own party in Nova Scotia called the Small Party, but it didn't win anything. Nevertheless, May's activism led to her briefly participating in Brian Mulroney's progressive conservative government by being a policy advisor to his Minister of the Environment, Tom McMillan. Man, it's always Mulroney. She eventually decided in 2006 to run to become the leader of Canada's Green Party. Like most Green parties of the time, the Canadian Green Party did not have any notable presence in the federal government, and their support base was so spread thin across the entire country that the odds of getting any seat were tiny. There wasn't a clear path or even necessarily a clear vibe the party had. May won the leadership, and while her national brand was technically growing, the party wasn't guaranteed to win any seats by any means. It didn't help that May would find herself in controversy in 2007 when she compared Stephen Harper's stance on climate change to Neville Chamberlain's appeasement of the Nazis. Then in August of 2008, an independent MP from Vancouver joined the Green Party, giving them their first and so far only seat in Parliament. However, this was when the Parliament was in recess, so that seat was never actually sat in by the Greens. In 2008, the goal was to get any seat in Parliament at all, but this led to an issue on how to focus the campaign. May being well known meant she had the best chance of winning a seat, so she focused on trying to win. With so much focus on her, there was worry about Green candidates elsewhere not getting enough coverage to help with their campaigns. Is it the Green Party or the Elizabeth May Party? In any case, no one won a seat. While May would continue to lead the Green Party into the 2011 election, there was no confidence in her actually getting into Parliament. One of the things my American viewers may find surprising or even envious about Canadian elections is that the actual campaigning period is quite short. Parliament officially dissolved on March 26th, and voting day was on May 2nd. That's only 38 days to canvass, campaign, and host debates. When it came to the issues, a lot of the positions were things you'd expect from each of the major parties. Conservatives want to lower corporate tax, the NDP wanted to raise it, Liberals are in the middle. All of them support healthcare, but just have their own numbers allocated for it. The Bloc wants anything that helps Quebec, the Greens want things that help protect the environment. So what then are some of the more unique issues or positions that stood out? For the Conservatives, one unique issue was their series of crime proposals that included expanding the prison system, further crackdowns on drug-based activities, and promoting internet surveillance legislation. All of those, especially the last one, got a lot of pushback. The other parties, while having their own proposals to combat crime, overall preferred to focus on policies that would be based around crime prevention rather than punishment. The Liberals, going a more moderate direction for this election, weren't exactly doing too much exciting or different, but one unique proposal was the idea of creating a learning passport, which would be this program to encourage secondary education students to attend Canadian universities by giving them $1,000 each year for up to 4 years to help pay for their tuition, and it wouldn't need to be paid back like a loan. The NDP, meanwhile, had perhaps the most radical stance on any single issue: abolish the Canadian Senate. Now, to make sense of this, the Canadian Senate is not like the US Senate where a senator gets 6 years before re-election. In Canada, senators were appointed and got to have their seat for life, or at least until the senator turned 75 and then they have to retire. While this might sound really out there, believe it or not, all the major parties at that time had beef with the Canadian Senate. Stephen Harper especially had his own set of drama with the Senate, which we don't have time to get into. Nevertheless, the NDP proposed to work on abolishing it altogether, viewing them as an unelected set of roadblocks to any major change in Canada. Now, this is easier said than done, as it would require approval from all provinces and, well, the Senate. But considering this proposal is popular even today, it's not that uncommon of a position, even if technically radical. But to quote or possibly misquote former Canadian Prime Minister Kim Campbell, an election is no time to discuss serious issues. Just as that gaffe helped tank her election efforts back in 1993, there were gaffes and smears in the 2011 election. In parliamentary elections, there are always hundreds of controversies and gaffes when you're electing that many people into office, so I'm sure there's plenty I've missed. For Michael Ignatieff, his main issue was being perceived as a carpetbagger, having spent so much of his adult life outside of Canada and being in more cosmopolitan and intellectual circles. His efforts to try and be more Canadian and down-to-earth had mixed results. Some saw it as him doing his best to connect with everyone, while others just saw it as poor pandering. Meanwhile, one of Stephen Harper's criticisms was that he was seen as a divisive type of candidate, and so to combat this, Harper would try to speak to immigrant groups to win their support. At one such event, it was leaked that Harper referred to them as "you people" in a tone that can very easily come off as rather rude and dismissive, and while it seems weird that such a simple thing would matter living today in the Trump era, back then that mattered a lot more, and this was certainly used as ammo to continue portraying the Conservative Party and Stephen Harper as divisive and uncaring. It didn't help that there was also a common trend of Stephen Harper often avoiding journalists and Conservative candidates refusing to attend local debates. But nevertheless, Harper would participate in the two federal debates. One was in English and the other was in French. After all, a Canadian leader needs to be able to speak both languages, and with Quebec being such an important factor, it gives the candidates the opportunity to win them over. The French debate will be brought up again later, but in the English debate on April 12th, there was one particular exchange that changed the course of the election.
Why do you have the worst attendance record in the House of Commons of any member of Parliament? If you want to be Prime Minister, you better learn how to be a member of Parliament first. You know, most Canadians, if they don't show up for work, they don't get a promotion.
Mr. Layton, I don't surrender to anybody in my respect for the institution of Parliament and my obligation to the people who put me there. So don't give me lessons about respect for democracy.
Well,
don't give me lessons.
Where were you
when
I was there standing up to Mr. Harper and voting against his policies, and you weren't in the chamber? You missed 70% of the votes. I think you need to understand a little bit more about how our democracy works. That's my only point.
That moment ended up striking a chord with many Canadians who disliked both Harper and Ignatieff. While the Greens and Bloc Québécois were also alternatives, Elizabeth May was notably not invited to the debates, while Duceppe wasn't a factor in the English debate like he was in the French one, coming off as the cranky separatist. There were a large number of people who disliked Harper's policies but found Ignatieff to be an ineffective leader. Leighton spent a lot of the debate criticizing both, but refreshingly coming at it from a more, come on, we can do better sort of attitude. Leighton criticizing Ignatieff's poor parliamentary attendance comes off as a disappointed grandparent rather than a hostile yelling opponent. Suddenly, the spotlight was on Leighton, and within a week, the NDP caught up to the Liberals in the polls. Then within another week, the NDP surpassed the Liberals and reached a higher polling average than the Liberals ever had the entire campaign. Jack Layton is just doing what he's done in previous elections, in that the exposure to his kind grandpa personality was making him a very likable candidate, and therefore increasing support for the NDP. Jack Layton's image of a kind grandpa during the campaign was also reinforced with a strong determination. Jack Layton had been given prostate cancer in 2010, but he had managed to keep it well under control and continued to campaign anyway, which is never going to be seen as anything but inspiring. Then Layton had an accident where he injured himself and needed a cane to walk, but despite that, Jack kept going to every campaign event he could and not letting it stop him. He even would get crowds excited by waving his walking cane triumphantly before speaking as a symbol of his determination. Like the old saying goes, it's one thing to talk the talk, it's another to walk the walk. The more Jack Layton seemed like a great anti-Harper leader, the more Ignatieff seemed like a terrible anti-Harper leader. More Liberal supporters were jumping ship. Polls were even starting to have the NDP come within a point or two of the Conservatives. For the first time in NDP history, there was a chance they could actually win. But alright, how did this election turn out? On May 2nd, people went to the polls, and as I alluded to in the beginning, the main overall result wasn't a terrible shock. Stephen Harper won the most votes in most seats, but he also finally won the majority government that he had been desperately wanting with 166 seats. The bigger shocks, though, were everything else. For the first time in Canadian history, Jack Layton and the NDP won second place in votes and seats, nearly tripling their seat counts to 103 seats, becoming the official opposition. The Liberals, meanwhile, lost half their seats and only had 34 seats, the worst showing in their party's history. Even worse than the Liberals, the Bloc Québécois lost nearly all of their seats, dropping down to only 4, losing official party status, meaning next time they wouldn't be given any federal election funds. Then, in a surprise result, Elizabeth May won her seat, giving the Green Party its first elected seat. The surprises continue when looking at the map. The red color used by the Liberal Party is replaced by seas of blue and orange for the Conservatives and NDP. But most notably, the NDP shockingly won a landslide in Quebec, winning 59 of its 75 seats. To help explain why this is both shocking and a big deal, I've brought the YouTuber Ravignon to help explain what happened in Quebec.
Hello! I am Ravi from the YouTube channel Ravignon. If you've heard from me before, it's probably because of a 3-part History of Quebec series where I talk about, well, Quebec, and I'm here to do some more of that. Namely, we want to understand why Jack Layton was so popular during the 2011 Canadian federal election among French Canadians. To summarize, it mostly comes down to short and long-term mistakes of his competitors. This cleared the path for the NDP to take a shot in a federal election, and the NDP doing a very good job making the most of it. Let's explore it. As Tiger Star already mentioned, the Bloc is a bit of a paradoxical concept. It's a party that supports the independence of Quebec and would rather see it out of Canada, but it participates in Canadian federal elections to exist as a seat at the table. Compared to previous leaders of the Quebec independence movement that only sought power in regional elections, the Bloc argues that as long as Quebec remains in Canada, then Quebec has a vested interest in having a voice in national politics, and they've positioned themselves as that voice. The Bloc has a lot in common with their political elders from the 60s in that they are social democrats that hold various progressive positions. But much like them, they're also a nationalist party and conservative in the ways that nationalist parties tend to be. If you were a Muslim woman, a Sikh man, or a member of the First Nations in Quebec, for example, you wouldn't really feel like they care much for you specifically. We could spend hours dissecting the Bloc on its own terms, or the terms of its critics, but an undeniable fact was that it was a very well-received party during its first 20 years of existence. It was always first place in Quebec, and it had a comfortable role as the third largest party in the country. In fact, in 1993, under its founder, Lucien Bouchard, It was even the second largest, which meant it tangled itself into leading the official opposition of a country it was trying to leave, funnily enough. The Bloc won the majority of Quebecois federal seats every single election up until 2008, and it's precisely this next one we're concerned with. The starting challenge is that in any kind of situation, it's hard to be a political party advertising itself for the 7th time to voters, and it gets even harder to reach out to the public in an election most people felt shouldn't have happened. In Quebec, Stephen Harper had a withdrawn approach that contributed to his mandate in the province. Early on, he had tolerable approval numbers for a federal conservative, and in 2006 he passed the Québécois Nation motion, which outlined a federal recognition that Quebec was a distinct nation within Canada, something that the sovereignty movement fought for throughout the 80s and 90s. Still, the Harper government had very sour sources of friction with Québécois society. Quebec was, and is, largely in favor of abortion, gay marriage, and green policy that moves away from oil, all which Harper had expressed himself against. The Québécois were also very opposed to the American war in Afghanistan, which Harper was trying to get Canada more involved in. As time moved on, the differences got worse, and Harper lost more and more of the few graces he had. Importantly, for a Canadian context, Harper was uncomfortably close to this Bush-era Republican Party Christian conservative politics. So, as his social policy started getting more ambitious and funding to Québécois cultural promotion initiatives was cut, Quebec would rise to strongly reject the Conservatives. In the 2011 election, less than 20% of Quebec voted for the Tories. But you see, though the parliament really wanted a federal election to break the impasses of 2010, the country overwhelmingly didn't. Harper didn't need Quebec to win. His real electoral battle was in Ontario, but this historically low performance in Quebec was also completely avoidable by his part. According to an Ipsos poll, about 70% of Canadians didn't want the 2011 snap election to happen. In this situation, whoever was framed as responsible for putting the public through the chores of following a campaign would be burdened on voting day, and after a big negotiation circus, a lot of these befell on the Bloc. Though the Bloc reflected most of Quebec's differences with the Harper government, they are a permanent opposition party by design, and they don't get things done by being in the government but by making pro-Quebec policy, as they see it, necessary to break important impasses. This is a coherent strategy, but it's not really an encouraging thing to put on a banner, is it? It's a strategy of no promises management. Management open to opportunities wherever they might come from, like an increasingly unpopular prime minister in your runnings. For millennials, the Bloc was also especially lame. At this point in time, younger voters also disliked the Bloc because if you were born in the 90s, like Merkel in Germany for kids in the 2000s, they were the only federal representatives you knew from childhood to adulthood. And people who wanted change, whether to the left or the right, were not going to get behind Wtf. Knowing this, and doing what the Bloc does, when the Harper government was about to lose the no-confidence motion, the Bloc approached them with what was essentially a ransom. Wtf told the Conservatives that he would save them in exchange for $2 billion for various tax compensations in Quebec. Wtf also added that even with the money, this was still not a guarantee that the Bloc would support the next government budget, so the Bloc was basically opening a door for further rescue payoffs down the line. Harper, seeing this for what it obviously was, didn't take the bait. Instead, the Conservatives framed the Bloc as traders in blackmail. The Bloc were quite literally selling their votes to the government or the opposition if they could get some scrap out of it, the Conservatives argued. And I mean, this was half true. Since they couldn't get their massive payday out of Harper, the Bloc supported the no-confidence motion, essentially attaching themselves to the list of reasons behind this very unpopular election. Immediately after that, they campaigned on a "the other guys are worse" kind of deal. Instead of bringing attention to their policy achievements in Quebec, which they had, the Bloc felt like running as the only option to prevent a conservative majority government, when, as we've discussed, they were quite willing to work and even continue the Conservatives' shelf life. So, with all these challenges and misplaced decisions, they were bound to lose. People were worried that the Bloc was becoming more concerned with political gains and the pursuit of independence than people's everyday concerns at a time when that was important, and they ended up performing very poorly as a consequence. Duceppe even ended up losing his seat. Now, the Bloc got off with a bust, but that still doesn't explain why the New Democratic Party won. The Liberals had been the natural alternative in Quebec federal elections whenever the Bloc was doing poorly. Quebec is one of those places that always votes for a flavor of progressive after all, but when regionalism underperforms, Quebec goes federalist and vice versa. However, the Liberals had been losing a lot of support with French Canadians in Quebec, gradually since 1982. When Pierre-Elliott Trudeau, the dad of the today Trudeau, passed the Canadian Constitution that Quebec absolutely hates. I can tell you more about that in this video, but let's stay on the subject. The short and long of it is that at this point in time, the Liberals were facing a decades-long problem with a lot of face to save, and they weren't doing enough to save it. For example, around 2006, the Quebec Liberals were involved in a 5-year-long corruption scheme that became a scandal called AdScam, where federal funds destined to promote the Canadian identity in Quebec were funneled into advertisers affiliated with the Liberal Party, maybe arguing that supporting the Liberals means supporting Canadianness, which went as well as you can imagine, and which hurt their credibility for the rest of the 2000s. After a very drawn-out decline and a few other scandals in the early 2000s, less than 10% of francophones in Quebec actually voted for Liberal candidates come 2011, which is a deep collapse from where they were in the 60s. In my judgment, much worse than the Conservative one. Every major party in Quebec dropping the ball gave a clear shot to the NDP, and they absolutely crushed it. It's hard to understate how much of their success was just Layton's personality. Layton was charismatic, funny, and very fluent in French. His history of activism and just his general demeanor contrasted a lot with Wtf and Harper, who were more groomed and more controlled establishment politicians. Layton, by comparison, was perceived as someone who was in the politics game because he really cared. His personal struggle with cancer since 2010 and his insistence to campaign despite it also made clear he was really invested in everything he did, which worked wonders for an NDP that had never broken ground in Quebec. Though the NDP is explicitly leftist, which works well with Quebec's political sensibilities, it has a Western Canadian, English Protestant texture that proved to be a difficult, almost insurmountable challenge to get elected in the majority French province of Quebec. If anything, Layton's greatest success in the more tactical aspect of politics was breaking that scheme. By professional and popular consensus, Layton also won the French language debates. He even did something amazing, something that every politician wants to do, a memorable one-liner, a zinger, the "because you'd be in jail" moment of Trump versus Hillary in 2016. In a moment when Duceppe said that voting for the Bloc was the only way to stop Harper, Layton kind of grinned at him, pointed at Harper and said, "But look, he's still there," which was a powerful point. If you weren't thinking too deeply about the conversation, it was just funny. But if you were, the point being made is that whereas the NDP could remove Harper by forming a Canadian government, the Bloc could not. So their whole campaign pitch as the only option to stop the Conservatives was flipped on the Bloc, and in a very artful way. He also called the Bloc a hockey team made of defensemen only, which I found equally poignant and funny. And there were, of course, some other things that the NDP did very well. As they started to get popular in Quebec, they mobilized to bring attention to their official stances on the province, outlined in an older document called the Sherbrooke Declaration. The NDP made clear that it was federalist and believed in a united Canada, but also that they were fine with asymmetrical cooperative federalism, where Quebec's differentiation would be accepted in a plurality of differentiated provinces. Unity doesn't mean uniformity, the text reads. Sherbrooke also outlined that the NDP would accept the results of a Quebec independence referendum, would it happen. On top of that, aside from Layton, there were some very good local candidates and campaigners that did their own part of the job very well. The end result of all these good moves for the NDP got them a very big victory in Quebec, with 59 out of the possible 75 seats, almost 80% of Quebec's representation. Still, this wasn't enough to win. Federally, the NDP gathered 103 seats, but the Conservatives gathered 166, which got them the so-teased majority government that the Bloc was trying to prevent. Importantly for the NDP, they now were a party with federal ambitions, which had over half its representation coming from a very regionalist province of the country. What would they do to be able to grow from there? Or more importantly, would they be able to do that? That is another story. But what's really important is that Layton proved that Quebec is willing to try federalism, provided that federalism feels safe and accommodating to its short and long-term national interests. The NDP's 2011 campaign paints an optimistic picture for supporters of Quebec in Canada and what could be possible. But it also suggests a type of federalism that is really controversial. So much so that it might have been one of the reasons why the NDP had a tougher time in Ontario. If Canadian federalism has to be loose, then maybe it wouldn't be much of a federalism at all in the minds of lots of Canadians. In any case, that's what Layton tried, and that's how Layton won Quebec. Back to the show.
Thanks, Robbie. So basically, whether federally as a whole or provincially like in Quebec, so much of the Canadian political landscape had seemingly been turned on its head, at least conventionally. For the Conservatives, after nearly 2 decades of being out of power, they were able to get back in with a more concentrated vision than under Mulroney, despite being told it would never happen. For the NDP, after over 4 decades of being told they would never break out of being a small party, skyrocketed to the opposition. Elizabeth May proved a Green can actually win a seat. Obviously, how these wins are going to be viewed depends on the person's politics, but nevertheless, optimism really carried the election. Conversely, the Liberals' approach of being cautious and not wanting to appear as anything but milquetoast or moderate not only failed to get them anywhere, but also gave them their worst showing in their party's history. The Bloc, meanwhile, also had a problem of staleness, but less from vision and more from the limitations of their vision. If you can't secede, support Quebec. But if another party is willing to support Quebec, what about you stands out anymore? Regardless, Canada was waiting to see how Stephen Harper would handle a majority government, and how Jack Layton would do as an official opposition leader.
Well, good afternoon. On February the 5th, 2010, I shared with Canadians that I, like 25,000 other Canadian men every year, had been diagnosed with prostate cancer. I have received overwhelming support. I undertook a series of tests at Princess Margaret Hospital here in Toronto. My battle against prostate cancer, as it turns out from these tests, is going very well. My PSA levels remain very, very low. However, these tests, whose results I received just last week, also indicate that I have a new cancer, non-prostate cancer, that's going to require further treatment.
On August 22, 2011, Jack Layton died from his second battle with cancer at the age of 61. The outpouring of grief was everywhere, and the level of admiration and respect that Layton had built with his friends, peers, and even opponents was very evident. Prime Minister Stephen Harper not only expressed his sadness at the news, but even gave Layton a state funeral, making Jack Layton the only leader of the opposition to ever receive such an honor. Whenever any figure as beloved and respected as Jack Layton dies before their trajectory seems to be finished, it's very easy to also be saddened by imagining what Canada potentially missed out on, even if we'll never know for sure, especially given how depressing, cynical, and awful politics are now just about everywhere. Layton's hopeful optimism not only highlights those differences, but can almost feel like a bygone era that we can never return to. Obviously, the world is complicated, to say the least, and no single man can make a utopia, but that kind of misses the point of Layton's philosophy in the first place. In Layton's letter to Canadians released by him 2 days before his death, it ends with the perfect summary of his creed. My friends, love is better than anger, hope is better than fear, optimism is better than despair, so let us be loving, hopeful, and optimistic, and we'll change the world. So what happened in Canada for the next election? Did the NDP continue their growth?
Justin Trudeau will be a majority government tonight.
Ah, right.